In a world with artificial intelligence, how do we transform education? Thanks for tuning in. I'm Daniel Lopez, and this is the AI Education Conversation, where we explore the opportunities, risks, and impacts of AI across education. If you'd like to join the conversation, check out the AIeducationconversation.com. Let's jump in. Hello, everyone. Happy Teacher Appreciation Week to all of the amazing teachers out there doing the crucial work of inspiring and educating our young people. I know the job is really hard and often thankless, but I hope folks around you and your students are reminding you just how amazing you are. Regardless of how our education system evolves, the relationship between a teacher and students will continue to be the secret sauce of learning. If you're not a teacher, show some love to teachers at your local school or in your network. Purchase them a coffee gift card, share some kind words. Speaking of teachers, I'm excited to bring to you my conversation with David Meechan, who is a senior lecturer in education at the University of Northampton, the United Kingdom. David also has experience teaching in early childhood and primary education. David and I touch on quite a few topics in our conversation, including how our countries are grappling with artificial intelligence almost 2 years since ChatGPT changed the game, how education needs to evolve in a world of AI, lessons on the death of cursive handwriting, reimagining assessments, and much more. I hope you enjoy my conversation with David and give him a follow at his socials after listening to our conversation. If you're interested in my takeaways, sign up for the conversation at the AIeducationconversation.com. I share all my show notes with my community 12 hours before sharing with my social media networks. If you want to continue supporting the podcast, a rating, a review, share on social media, recommendation to a colleague, all of these things are free and go a long way in helping to amplify our space so that I can host bigger and better conversations. Finally, if your school district or organization is ready to explore AI and make a change, I am available for workshops and consulting at the AIeducationconversation.com. Humans at the heart of education. Enjoy the episode. David Meechan, welcome to the AI Education Conversation.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me.
I know as of today you are in the higher education space, but in talking to you before, I know that you didn't always start there. So maybe give us a little bit of a sense of what you're holding as you enter this conversation here.
Yeah. So I started at the opposite end of the education spectrum to where I am now, should we say. I was a kindergarten teacher originally and actually still hold true to many of those principles and values from my kind of early training days. And then I went on to work in primary schools as well. So you're looking at probably ages from really from birth up to about 8. It's kind of my area of teaching. And a big focus, obviously, birth to 8 is about child development, skill development, and really kind of supporting children holistically to develop the skills that they're going to need to then be successful in education afterwards. I also went out, had quite a few international experiences. So that gave me a really kind of broader horizon around educational approaches and made me very conscious that actually, although we have kind of core concepts around education, which are quite global now, there's still lots of nuances around the edges of that to do with culture and curriculums and so on. And then, yeah, I was really fortunate to start working in higher education in 20. So that was my first role. And since then, really still researching in to do primary education and early childhood education, but also now being much more involved in digital and technology aspects as well.
Interesting when you mentioned you've had experiences going abroad and noticing differences in the educational systems. I'd love to unpack just that for a second. Where did you study and what were some of the things you noticed that were different?
Okay, so as an undergraduate, I spent a semester in Japan, which was kind of my first really, wow, this is very different to how we're educated in the UK, in England. And I was in an elementary school there. And so I think it was the first time really that I stopped and realized how socially constructed our approaches to teaching and learning are. Typically in elementary schools in Japan, there's one teacher, 40 children, whereas in England, we tend not to go over 30 children. And for the lower grades, lower classes, you'll have a teacher and a teaching assistant. But I firsthand witnessed a very competent teacher managing, teaching and learning to a class of 47-year-olds with minimal disruptions, and literally sat back and thought, wow, there's much more at play here than just teaching and learning. And then another contrasting experience after I had been teaching for a while, I went to volunteer in Malawi, which is in southern Africa. So one of the consistently poorest countries in the world in terms of GDP, and taught standard one there. So that was 80 children in a classroom, no desks, no chairs. There was blackboards at the front, and they were sat in rows. Local language was Chichewa, which they were taught in, but I had some Malawian students who were assisting me in translating. And really, I think because of my early childhood background, I'd been really against things like rote learning. I saw that as kind of just never do it. But actually, when you have a class of 80 children, rote learning had a real core place in that curriculum and the approach to how we were teaching. And obviously, I used group work and other aspects as well. So I think from those two contrasting experiences, I was always open to learning and changing and innovating my practices in relation to the needs of the students really that I was working with.
It's fascinating to hear both of those stories, and most of my experience is really only in public education here in the United States and higher education a little bit. I've been fortunate to have access to a lot of different higher education institutions, so I haven't worked firsthand and seen under the hood, if you will. But yeah, even just hearing what you said, the idea of having 80 students in a class and like a in a public in like a K to 12 type environment, that wasn't physical education where you might see something like that here. It just feels very surprising to me. And then obviously, as we know, in a lot of like lecture settings, slash, you might even have this. I'm not sure the size of some of your lecture halls. It is not uncommon here in the United States to see some lectures, especially general lectures, where you might have 400 students in a massive auditorium type setting with one professor in some of those generalized classes. So that's more when you would see, I think, a fluctuation in those ratios a little bit.
Yeah, I think in the UK, there's definitely been an approach to smaller size classes, especially in kind of, I mean, I'm education, so it's really about trying to establish relationships with students, get to know students and know their personal kind of narratives and stories. Obviously, that's not the case in all subjects and all faculties and approaches, and some of the other universities still have large lecture theatres. Where I work now was a new campus when I started in 2018, and they purposely didn't um, build any typical standard lecture halls. So our class sizes don't really go above 30 students, and that was a conscious decision to seek kind of quality experiences over the quantity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So you're coming in with this experience, this depth and breadth of experiences, some very early education, as you described, even having experiences checking out other systems now in higher education. How does AI bake into this? What was your first experience leveraging artificial intelligence tools? What tools did you use? Give us a sense of how that engagement first started.
I think prior to, I mean, really, it was your typical ChatGPT December 2022, but I think I really have to go just before that. Obviously, during COVID and online learning, I just seemed to have a natural flair for, oh, this is a change. This is an opportunity to innovate and do something different. And whereas online learning was a real challenge in for lots of reasons, I actually very quickly began to see the challenges, but also attempt to see solutions to such challenges. So using things like interactive whiteboards online, things like Miro, if you're familiar with Miro, Google Jamboard, and really trying to give students a feel for, yes, we're still collaborating, we're still co-constructing. Although we can't necessarily see each other's faces across the classroom, we can still see each other's interactions. And that was very well received within the subject area I work. So I think that gave me a confidence to innovate and try new things and continue trying new things. And then when ChatGPT came out, it was December when I started to tinker with it and play around with it. And I really just couldn't get over the initial, wow, this is incredible. And actually, it's free, which is really important around technology. And I'm sure we'll discuss more about that as we go through this session. But I then introduced it to my best friend who was a paramedic and had just returned to university. And we were sat in the pub in a good old, I think it was probably a Friday evening. And I said, have you get a load of this, have a look at this. And obviously his background is health medicine. And he was doing an essay at the time and he put it in the title and he got the feedback and he literally just sat back and went, wow. Because I was impressed with it initially for what I had used it for, but I wasn't aware of the scope it had. And by his reaction, he went, this is incredible. This is really good. And then shortly after that, the second kind of, so that was the first kind of wow moment. The second wow moment, my wife's a nursery nurse, and one of her friends was around who works with her. Lots of years of experience, probably more than 15 years experience working with children. She'd gone back to college to do another qualification, and was really having a difficult time get the knowledge in her head into the kind of academic format that the college was requiring. And I said, well, there's this new tool. Why don't you have a look at this? And showed a chat GPT. And again, the penny dropped and wow, this can just take my ideas and help me structure them and put them in a much more academic kind of style. And we played around with it. And I think in hindsight, those two initial experiences, I thought, wow, this isn't just about my friends using it. This is actually, I've got a responsibility to make sure I'm going to be teaching my students how to use this. And very quickly, I tried to think, well, if I was a student, how would I use this? Would I use it to cheat? Well, my initial attempt would probably be having a go at writing an essay or constructing something in full and seeing if I could get away with it. And I thought, well, how about if I go one step further than this and actually deconstruct all these processes? And that was really interesting because it was a really contentious time then, and still is in many ways. Can you use AI in assessments? And so that was really kind of the whole of last year. There was so many changes so quickly with AI. I remember I got to the Easter holidays. I think that's your equivalent of your spring break outside. And I literally closed my laptop for 2 weeks because my head was just so full of new AI tools and you can do this and you can do that. And I just had to have a break from it because I was just full up. And actually after that, at Easter, I opened my laptop up, re-engaged with it and really constructively broke down, if I'm going to use AI-based tools, how can I use them? Where should I be using them? And why am I using them, really importantly? And that helped me kind of develop a structure to my approach with how I was going to teach students to use such tools.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of what you just laid out really resonates with me. I mean, if I could start from the top just from a second here, I would say, like, especially the scope of impact question exploration that you went through. I think I went through a very similar type of process. And to a certain extent, I'm still going through that because to your point, I feel like I have a really excited understanding, if you will, of some of the use cases, some of the interactions on how this technology, on how generative AI chatbots can be used in specific educational roles. But in the beginning part, I was in that curiosity phase too, and I still am. I think outside of education and looking for other ways. But as you were talking about your story, one thing I distinctly remember is I had this really great idea around January, February of that initial year as well. I was like, I wonder if you could use these chatbots to help analyze financial aid letters because here in the United States, there are so many students that they are applying to colleges, they get accepted to colleges, they get these financial aid letters back, and they're very complex to read, right? And if you don't have a teacher or an advisor walking you through that, and to your earlier point, just around the complexity of student ratios and what that can look like, it really does require you to sit with an adult, right? In an ideal world, your parents plus you with an adult and talking about what's on this letter, decoding what some of these words like loans, Stafford loans, or grants, and all these things mean, and then being able to really translate in practical terms what it looks like. And so I actually set up this whole role play to do it. I actually, walking out of this experience, I thought it did it really well. I actually documented a lot of this stuff on the seventh episode of this podcast. But then what I ended up doing is screenshotting a lot of this and posting it in a very well-known Facebook group around counselors, just because I was curious to get their reactions. Like, if am I the only one who thinks this is pretty amazing, or am I off? And a lot of the comments were, "Wow, I'm about to get replaced, this is unbelievable," those types of things. And I was like, wow, so okay, like I'm not the only one feeling like this has the potential to be like a really transformative use case for our work. And to your other point, it's just like, oh, it's so exciting to think about. Okay, so that's just like the work that I intimately know. I wonder across the board, is everybody else thinks about ways that they can leverage this technology in their work, what other transformational use cases are coming out. So that really stood out to me. I think something else that you mentioned, which also really resonates, is this idea of it's just the volume is feels unbelievable right now. And obviously, I'm somebody I think it's very similar to you where I'm diving in head first on the deep end, right? So I do think there's this world where, especially if you're in education, at least here in the United States, you can choose to put your head in the sand and like not acknowledge it and not really get a lot of that fire hose to the face if you'd like to around some of these things. And a lot of people are. I'm still doing presentations sometimes where I ask people on a scale of 1 to 5, like how much do you know about artificial intelligence? They're on the 1 or 2 end. I think that's okay. But I also think to your point, we're entering this really exciting moment where it has the potential to be really transformative in terms of the way that we do education and trying to think about what it will really take to systematically bring these people along, right? And get them invested, get them interested in joining kind of that particular piece. But also, the longer you stay in it, as I think you and I have, yeah, you definitely can start to feel burnt out because it feels like every single moment of the day between technology companies and educational institutions coming out with new guidance or new developments or those things, there is just so much to keep track of. And it's a very exciting time, but there is also a lot to just breathe on. And I think your approach of just saying, okay, pause, let's really think about my role in this. Let's think about what the impact is for my classroom or my day to day, to what extent I believe I should be using tools, to what extent it's really about tools versus something else, maybe just having a philosophy, right, or a policy. I think those are all really critical questions to ask. And I think you kind of allude to something I think is really critical, which is I think the outcome of having some of these conversations for some teachers doesn't necessarily have to be you then have to go back to your classroom and adopt 7 tools that you're using in your classroom. The takeaway could just be, "Hey, I'm gonna continue to learn about this. My goal is to set up policies so that we're acknowledging that this technology exists and many of us might be interested, and that's where we're gonna be for right now," right? And I also think that feels okay. You also spent some time talking a little bit about some of the conversations that you all might have been having in your neck of the woods on artificial intelligence. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and hear about how that may or may not align to what the experiences were here in the United States, how it might be different over the last, I don't know, I guess take your timeline. I'll say 12 months for the sake of this. How would you say that the conversation started and where is it evolving to now, just in terms of your perspective on either even just your university, the education landscape as a whole in the United Kingdom? I'm curious to just understand like where you all are at in your thinking with artificial intelligence and education, how that's looked.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be parallels. Just coming back to my personal take on it again, and this is where coming back to my early childhood experience, for me, that those first few months, and even now, and you've alluded to this, it's been so playful, play around with AI and what can it do, and actually that when you're playing with something, there's usually a sense of optimism. It's not playful if it's pessimistic, is it? And it was really interesting to go into work and talk to people and then go, oh, I'm not sure about this. And I was like, but this is incredible. And actually the fear factor, those the last 6 months and the fear factor is still present. I think it's been rebalanced slightly now. I'm a big believer in recognizing what you can control and what you can't control. And this is, I almost say ChatGPT was really Pandora's box. It's been opened. It's not going to be closed. And actually, how can we engage constructively with it? And we have a moral duty to engage constructively with it as educators, especially in higher education. So yeah, there was lots of initial scaremongering about AI is going to take our jobs. It's going to take over. What happens if it starts making decisions that really humans should be making? And again, being involved in research and kind of ethical and moral concerns around this and the accountability aspects, especially with I don't know if you came across Auto GPT. That was the beginning of last year, which was kind of one of the first automated GPTs. It was on GitHub. I remember playing around with that and just watching it make decisions and move down. And I was thinking, wow, this is next level stuff. And this is going to really be of concern for lots of people. So interestingly, some of the biggest universities in the UK banned ChatGPT last year. So places like Cambridge, Bristol, Edinburgh, Manchester outright banned it. I think that was around last Easter. And my initial concern around that was if you're banning something that's freely available, it's still going to be used. And fortunately, I was really happy to work at an institution that took a very pragmatic approach and said, we're just going to hold off. We're just going to let this play out a bit more, and we're not going to make any rash decisions. And actually, that really gave me license to not only experiment as I had been doing anyway, but to begin to share some of my experimentation with colleagues and say, look, yes, it is scary initially, but it can be used for this and it can be used for this. And actually, it can be used in really constructive ways. There were still concerns, even in my institution. So, a huge concern, as we know, is around the privacy aspects, what information is being put in. And that's not just a concern for me as a lecturer using it, that's a concern for anybody engaging with these models. And think we very quickly, we put together a steering group at the university, which I was part of. And we had it was good because it wasn't an echo chamber of this is fantastic, and it wasn't an echo chamber of this is terrible. There were really constructive discussions had within that group. And I think it really reflected the wider conversations that were happening. But what was interesting was how quickly some universities were to ban it. And then I think it was in July, so that would have been March. In July last year, there was a retraction of those bans when the tone kind of changed. And there was very much this isn't going anywhere. How are we going to move forwards with this? So a big push towards, I suppose, what termed as AI literacy for academics and staff to then try and encourage, because if you haven't got AI literacy in staff and academics, it's going to be harder to instill it in students. Although in a few years' time, I'm adamant students will be coming through and showing me how to use AI, the latest AI tools. But at the moment, we have the opportunity to still be ahead of this curve in terms of the adoption and the changes. So I'd say it's generally, in terms of policy and guidance, there's been a significant shift to a more positive approach to using AI to enhance teaching and learning and assessment. However, the reality is that the vast majority of academics are still nowhere near in using it in their teaching or learning and so on. And coming back to one of your points there, I do think it's really interesting. I have to be very conscious when I talk about AI to my students that this is not the only way to approach learning and study and an assessment in this time frame. And I think it's really important that students still get exposed to teachers or academics who are quite traditional in their approach. Because if students can begin to make the connections between more traditional approaches and maybe more technology based approaches, then actually that's them developing a critique of their experience. And that's what we want. We want we want graduates to go out there and be able to critique firsthand the information they're receiving and how it's being received, and then move forward and really consider, well, what does that mean to them? Is it of use? Isn't it of use? And to build on that and go from there.
It's very interesting how when you describe the trajectory of some of the AI conversations taking place in your region, in so many ways, I felt like you could have just plugged in the United States and that experience was going to look very similar to how it's gone down here. Maybe I would add some sub stories, if you will, around things like AI detection, which has been a big hot topic here and continues to be here in the US. But a lot of the general art has been very similar. I think too, one thing that to the last point that you made around where the sentiment around artificial intelligence seems to be positive. I would say here, I think there's misconceptions or conceptions. Let me not even say misconceptions because some of it might be true around things such as AI is going to take over the world. AI is going to replace our jobs. AI is difficult to use, is very technical. AI is only going to perpetuate cheating. So those are some of the beliefs out there. I think from folks who aren't really using or the technology firsthand, right, are really looking at mainstream media and using that to inform their perspectives on this topic rather than trying something out themselves and then using that to determine like their personal beliefs. But I would say generally folks are I would say the broader sentiment, I agree with you here is more of like, hey, it's positive or it's a good thing. Maybe not totally understanding like why it's a good thing or to what extent it is, but it's a good thing. It's going to be like a positive thing for society. I think the issue that has been popping up that I've also been thinking a lot more about, had some guests talk about this most recently, Winston Roberts, is that access piece, right? And I think what makes access here in the United States a big challenge as well is our system for education, especially public education, is so decentralized. Local school districts, local boards of education, states, they have a tremendous amount of power. I think is one of the big barriers we're going to have as we think about what systematic adoption could look like, right? Is that the system that we have in education is just really multi-layered and complex and multifaceted. There's multiple deciders at multiple levels within the context here. When you think about access there, is would you say systematically that's a challenge you all are navigating as well because of the system? Was it, or is it more just about educating folks in that way?
We are very clued up around not just equality in terms of these aspects, but around equity. And you can't talk around technology without exploring things like the digital divide. Um, and again, kind of during COVID and the pandemic being online, we were really aware of this as an institution, as a university, and as a country, that there was simply such technologies and challenges were compounded really by access to or not access to technology. So yeah, we're really conscious of it. And one of the things we've been working towards, and I think most universities will be following suit, and that will be that literally if you enroll at a university, then you will get access to the latest kind of AI tools or usage of tools out there. I know there's been some issues with the licensing of Copilot. Microsoft's Copilot, it was extremely expensive. And I think they kind of felt they were a bit like first to market because everybody's already got, Microsoft Office or 365 institutions that they had a license to do this. But interestingly, was it Sam Altman in the last few days at Harvard stated that a big piece of moving forwards with AI-based technologies and general artificial intelligence is going to be about access and ensuring that access is rolled out. I mean, it's all very good saying that. What that actually looks like in reality, it's far more challenging. But I think there's dangers in standardization when it comes to education. If we start to standardize interactions with AI, if we start to standardize that every school or every university or every discipline should be using this type of AI, it just creates it dominates, doesn't it? And when you have a dominant kind of approach or a dominant narrative, it squeezes out the alternatives. And really, we don't want to, we don't want AI to become an exclusive tool. We really want it to kind of be as accessible and as inclusive as possible. But how do you get there from profit driven, tech based ventures? It's really, yeah, it's a complex scenario, which I don't know enough about, to be honest.
Yeah, totally. And we don't have to go down a rabbit hole here. I know that this is probably out of the realm of both of our expertise, but I think you bring up some interesting points. And to one of the last comments you made in something you said earlier as well that I'm also holding on to is you'd mentioned that you don't necessarily believe that AI should be in every classroom, right? Like if there's some teachers that are more humanities focused or non-technological focused, and then you have some that are focused, like that feels great, right? For you in terms of like your perspective. And then I heard you say something similar just now where you're like saying that we don't necessarily, one of the things we maybe don't need to be doing as we think about how AI is deployed across education is being very prescriptive about what exactly it looks like or to what like exactly what use cases you should be using AI for versus what you can't. I would say generally I agree with that perspective. I also don't even know that there's anybody equipped, to be honest, in artificial intelligence in education at this point to fully say these are all of the things you should be using AI for versus there's the things you're not. To your earlier point and to our earlier exchange there, it feels like so much of this is still untapped potential around like how folks could be using it when we really unleash our full creativity and trying to use different AI tools and exploring with different AI outputs, such as image-based tools, audio, text. Just thinking about the possibilities of what that can create in a classroom feels very exciting. I also agree with you that not every classroom needs to have AI. I definitely agree with that. I think how I enter this conversation and what I'm seeing and feeling in my day to day is that a lot of classrooms here in the United States in public education aren't fun places to be right now for the students as well as for the teacher, right? And I believe that using tools that are AI powered could be generative AI tools, but I think what a lot of folks are not recognizing as well is that generative AI tools such as ChatGPT aren't the only types of artificial intelligence out there that exist, right? When we talk about AI, AI is electricity, right? It's going to power a whole new set of tools and experiences and devices for the future. It's not just going to be a chatbot that produces text, audio, or input. That's what we have in the last 2 years, right? A year and a half. It's not what it's gonna fully be. But whether you're using AI or not, if we can ensure that a teacher has the mental bandwidth to create a really fun experience that they're both really excited to teach about and students really enjoy engaging, and we provide appropriate latitude for those teachers to be able to teach lessons, granted, albeit within their content, but not so prescriptive that it hinders creativity. My hope is that we can just make school a fun place to be again, right? And kids actually go to school and they like learning and they're learning things that are actually practical and important to their life. And teachers enjoy teaching it because it's things that allow them to build relationships with students and to be able to share with them their advice navigating this very complex place that we call Earth, and hopefully teaching them things that feel hyper relevant rather than things that feel so absent of needing to be used in a day-to-day basis. And I can't say that's the standardized experience in every classroom across the United States today. And I think many teachers would agree. I know that there's many teachers that are saying, like, yeah, I wish I could do that, but also I'm expected to teach for this like very high stakes exam that we're doing in a few months, and I've been told these are the 7 things we have to teach, and I have to teach in this way or else, because if my students don't do well on this exam, that's gonna be a reflection on our school or me, right, or how that goes. So I think that's part of the issue. I don't think AI necessarily solves that, but I think potentially what AI does is it creates bandwidth for us to be able to engage in more of this type of learning. And I do also think, and one thing I'm not also saying is that AI solves that problem. I think we have other big problems to solve, right, in the educational experience that for our students, for our teachers that we need to go through as well. So all that to say, that's a long-winded of say I agree with your perspective here. And what I'm hoping is that having access to this technology forces us to have a conversation about what the educational experience looks like in what could be a transformative way, right? Rather than saying, well, let's just tweak this or tweak this. No, let's really get under the hood of the system and say, what can be fundamentally different? Why do we have to have 6 periods in a day? Why does it only have to be 15 minutes of these subjects? Why can't we combine subjects and try to teach things interdisciplinary, right? And just trying to like foundationally talk about the experience and see what some really smart, talented people in schools can cook up around making their experience engaging and fun for themselves and for students.
Yeah, I mean, I've just wrote down in my notes. It's very much about standards, not standardization. This is 2024. And when you look at kind of Anglo-American education-based systems, they've changed very little in 100 plus years, and there's even more. I mean, in the England specifically in the last 10 years, 10 years ago, there was a shift towards a knowledge-based curriculum. And really, we're crying out for a skills-based curriculum because the knowledge today isn't the knowledge that, students are going to need necessarily in the future. That they need transferable skills, and whether that is technology is in kind of digital technology based, or really just kind of getting hands on, experiencing, learning in full blown kind of sway. And I think the really important part you've highlighted there is if we can get teachers, the majority of teachers, to enjoy teaching, there will be a real confidence there. And I do think the knowledge based curriculum actually detracts from teachers' confidence to teach because there's a concern about what they're teaching, not how they're teaching. And very much having my early childhood background, it is about how we're teaching and it's about how children and students are learning. Because actually, if we understand the how, it's much easier to move on to the why. And then from there, the what, and really it's building that kind of that critical literacy, which feeds in nicely to AI literacy and so on. So yeah, I think in terms of professionalism, fundamentally it's about trust, isn't it? If you train teachers and give teachers a license to teach, then they'll run with it. But also there's a concern that for so many teachers, they've never been allowed to do that. giving them that amount of freedom is also really scary. And I experienced that when I went to Malawi and there wasn't a curriculum. After having trained and worked in England, where there's always been a curriculum and you always know what you're teaching, the initial kind of shock was, yeah, it was exactly that, a shock. So, yeah, how these kind of bigger narratives play out in the different education systems, obviously, departments for education in the UK, in England, and so on, they're going to have a massive pivotal role in how this policy is decided.
So I know that you mentioned your background is in early elementary education, right? Or at least you spent quite a good portion of your career in that space. That's a question I would say I get quite frequently from listeners of this podcast to folks I talk to outside of it is really probably twofold, right? Which is because younger students are not going to be as interested potentially in engaging with AI tools in the same way that high school, higher ed students are, as an example. And then also there's real privacy concerns around just acceptable terms, use agreements. Most of them are 13 years or older with parental guidance, or there may be some differences. But usually in any capacity, it doesn't allow for students, let's say kindergarten to fifth grade, to really engage with directly any type of these AI tools. I'm curious, given your perspective, how do you think students in elementary education should or should not be engaging with artificial intelligence? Is there actually some appropriate use cases for them to use AI tools directly? Do you see it more as like just having conversations, but maybe not there? Like, how are you grappling with this? How these tools could be or could not be helpful for students in those grades?
Yeah, so I have an approaching 5-year-old and an approaching 7-year-old as myself. So I kind of see it firsthand at home, whether it's Hey Alexa or Hey Google, all of these devices are based on AI tech, aren't they? So I think for lots of parents and teachers, actually, you mentioned earlier about this AI is everywhere and how we define AI. It's still such a general concept. I think we need to become smarter at conceptualizing it and actually being aware of where it is, not being scared of where it is, but aware of where it is and how it works. So yeah, for elementary school students, primary school students, obviously the legalities around access is in law, but I don't think they'll exist forever. Nothing exists forever, but they will be changeable. I do think one of the concerns around over reliance on generative AI and stuff is that it's going to de-skill learners. So is there a window, a golden window of opportunity to actually build the foundational skills of critiquing, exploring, and so on before technologies are introduced? I think again, this comes back to the standardization issue because it might be open to say elementary school students, but then lots of students will have been introduced to such tools anyway in their home environment, and other students won't have been introduced to it again. So again, is this playing into your digital divide? Okay. Now, education is only one aspect of socialization, and it's not a panacea to correcting everything, but it does go some way to addressing possible challenges. But I do think when these models are, and they are already, I mean, we've seen with OpenAI's moving into kind of image creation, audio, videos, and so on. I think there's real potential there for elementary based students, if it's appropriate and they can get access to them, to create videos, work together as a class and play around with prompts, not having to do any typing. Imagine that, just talking to the AI and seeing what happens. And so that back and forth is actually going to be really important because what I would be interested in is what are the processes that's going on cognitively for those children and how are they learning from that? And how much more engaging would an English session be where they're having to create their own videos by using an AI model than actually having to sit there and write their own story when that child has for the last 3 years been subconsciously told that they're not very good at writing because the person next to them can write a story, 4-page story in the time that they can write one paragraph. So I think the opportunity to work in different mediums should be really exciting for elementary school students and teachers. And fundamentally, it's the teachers who are going to have the responsibility or the capacity, hopefully, to introduce such approaches to using AI. And again, I think as long as it's done in a kind of constructive safe. And what I mean by safe is being aware of what information is being shared, who's having control over it, ownership over it, and how that information is then used after it's been entered are going to be key concerns. But there has been shifts already towards this. Companies are aware that user data is really important. And actually the fact that, I mean, we only have to look back a few years to Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and the issues around that, that actually tech companies do not want to repeat those mixes. And that's ever so important when it comes to ed tech companies, because it's not just about technology, obviously the educational aspect, and there is a moral kind of imperative to make sure that the users are protected. So yeah, I mean, I'm just in the middle of developing a session for primary school teachers on using AI, but much more focusing on kind of addressing workload challenges, using it for planning, and really looking at how it can help teachers. All my students hear me talk all the time about working smarter and not harder. So I think there's a key opportunity there. But again, there's still that big fear factor. Is it going to take my job? And again, I'd say play around with AI, engage with it, because the more teachers engage with it, actually, the more they recognize that it's not going to take their job. Because actually, the human connections, the rapport that you establish with students, and I think this is at all levels, is really key to being an educator and being educated. So yeah, that's where I'm at with it.
Yeah. Well, with teachers in particular, when teachers say like, is it going to take my job? I'm like, well, to be honest, even if it does take one of your jobs, I think you can afford to give one up because you have like 7 jobs when you're a teacher. So I kind of joke about that sometimes. But all that to say, no, what you said kind of sparked an interesting thought for me too, which I don't know that I've like really grappled with until this moment. But to your earlier point of like, if there's now moments where students in elementary school grades, let's say as an example, are using AI or using technology to generate like a creative project. And an example I'm thinking of too is I had a previous guest, Dr. James Hudson. He just brought up how with his son, he has a younger son, he will use AI and his son sometimes will be like, Dad, can we create a Pokemon using ChatGPT? And so he'll work with the son, like they'll have a conversation where they're messing around with prompts and he'll say, like, I want a dragon that breathes fire and goes through some of those pieces. And they'll use some of those image creators to create it. It then occurred to me, I'm like, well, if they're going through that experience, does it actually really matter that they did it that way versus his son sitting down and like drawing it and essentially trying to create like the same thing? I also am thinking about some like maybe modern day examples where this is already kind of playing out a little bit and it may actually be leading to just changes in the skills that our young people are walking away with. And one thing that I was thinking about is I'm like, oh, this kind of reminds me of the handwriting cursive thing where like growing up, it felt like it was very important that I learn how to do cursive. And so I did. And yeah, now I mean, I think I have a better signature than probably 13-year-olds do. Maybe not better than 50-year-olds do, but better than the 13-year-olds, right? But I'm like, realistically, all I ever need to do with cursive is sign my name really nice on something. And now even some of that is being outsourced because now we have things like DocuSign where like I don't even have to, write in hand. So it makes me wonder how important different outputs are actually, or how we think they actually are versus the inputs, right? The actual the creative thought input that we're putting into it versus the outputs.
I think you've hit a nerve there with handwriting, because I'm always been on a mission to abolish handwriting classes because they're still taught in the UK quite religiously, and comments about handwriting. Now, my handwriting is terrible, but actually, what does it matter? Because I very rarely use it.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so the process is, I think one of the challenges for education systems is if the outputs are important, because that leads to assessment and that leads to grades and that leads to external exposure of whether education is improving. And I think with the politicization of education, it's became very important to evidence that education is always improving, whether that's artificially improving or what is a big thing. But again, so it really comes back to assessment for me, is if you're going to change the skills that are being taught in education systems, which I believe we need to kind of address the next 100 years of human development across the globe, actually our assessment processes need to change as well. And I mean, interestingly, you know, university assessments in when I'm going back hundreds and hundreds of years were all oral. They were all discussion based. Okay, even if you think back kind of ancient Greeks, it was all discussion. It was all about oration. Okay, then handwriting. Well, the essay came in, and so on. And we seem to have been stuck there for so long, so much so that with ChatGPT and that, what's one of the solutions? Well, let's just have all exam-based stuff again. Let's have closed exams in halls. To me, it just feels really uncomfortable, those discussions, because why go backwards when we can go forwards? When there's a real opportunity to go forwards, as you've already alluded to, across the whole approach to how we educate, and to what education is fundamental. We don't want education to be a purely restrictive process. And education is really a platform for children, students to kind of take with them into the rest of their lives and beyond. So I think it needs to be skill based and adaptable to the unknown unknowns of what the future holds.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think if to that exact point, I mean, there's no way that the system transforms with us out solving or doing something radically different as it relates to grading and assessments, right? That because so much of the way that schools operate, so much of the way that teachers and principals and everybody operates, our behaviors are defined by like these two things, right? Because we obviously want our students to do well on those assessments because those are how our own report cards are defined or our accountability with the state or with the national government. So that informs our behaviors at a very ground level. And that is those are really two of the critical pillars that lead to all of the educational experience playing out the way that it does today. So I could not agree more. And if I was a teacher today and I could go back and there were so many times now where instead of like asking students to complete a short answer response or doing an essay or something like that, like if I was in a position to be able to say like, hey, you have a choice as to how you want to create assignment, I would also welcome like a 10-minute podcast submission. I would welcome you to create your own photo collage, even if you don't create the photos by hand. If you want to like create 5 images using an AI image generator, and then you have to explain to me what each one means and like how it's connected to like what we just talked about or what you learned in visual form. Like I think like things like that feel like such a great way to be able to use some of the technology that exists today, not even outside of artificial intelligence, to just make school more fun. And students would have a lot more fun doing, I think, something like that to demonstrate their learning than always it being a 5 paragraph essay or a short answer response or a multiple choice test or any of those things that we've become so just accustomed to, right? And we're using as a crutch in so many ways.
So if that was to happen from elementary school through, it'd be incredible, because one of the things I find teaching at postgraduate levels, so we've got a new MA education program starting in September at the university. And we've been able to get through an approach to assessment called negotiated assessment. So essentially, we present the learning outcomes to the students, and then the students decide how they meet it, whether that's a presentation, whether that's an essay, whether it's a podcast, a poster. So we're really excited about that because it's negotiated, but it's also very inclusive. So the idea is that students will play to their strengths. However, on the back of that, we're also very aware for many students who have only ever really came through right and wrong exam based style assessments, an essay is familiar. So they need to hold on to that. Whereas approaching it from a different way will be really almost too difficult to comprehend. So really, we need kind of these top bottom up reforms as opposed to the top down pressures, which seem to be meaning that more formal assessments. I mean, in England now we have a reception baseline assessment for 4-year olds within the first 6 weeks of them starting school across the whole country, and they call it an assessment, not a test, but it is essentially a test. So it's yeah, these. Will I be able to challenge some of this? I hope so.
My hope again is it serves as a catalyst to just really disrupt and invite this conversation, right? Which I originally had a similar level of optimism with the pandemic. I was like, well, this is awful. This is probably one of the worst things I've ever experienced my entire life. And it is for a lot of people. And also like, it does feel like there's potentially a silver lining there. I also had a little bit of additional optimism because here in the United States, a lot of colleges ended up generating what are called test optional policies for admissions, where now instead of having every single student complete the SAT or ACT, they had the option of whether or not they could submit that, or they could essentially be considered just based on their transcripts and based on like the essays to submit those things. I thought that was a fantastic move for equitable access across universities and for not using a test score to make a determination of a student's intelligence or their ability to persist. What is discouraging me a little bit is now there's a lot of institutions that are rolling back to that. I say a lot, but it's more of a handful. There's a lot that have still decided they're going to keep it, which I'm excited about. But what I don't want to happen is for us to default back into some of these things that never were a good idea. To for us to like mandate that some of these things happen. So I'm hoping now that artificial intelligence technology just puts us in a world where to not use it is to not set up your students for success, but to use it also requires a foundational shift to the way learning happens across the board in your school, right? I think that's the general hope I have and how I see this playing out when I think of how transformation happens. I want to make sure we talk about your book because I know you've alluded to it a little bit here. I think if I had to maybe connect some of the dots, it seems like even your the some of the moments you've taken to just say, "Hey, I've been shot by a fire hose of artificial intelligence updates, and now I'm gonna hit pause. I'm really gonna think for myself to what extent maybe even that is gonna be helpful for others." I hear you talking about some of these use cases. It feels like a lot of those things, if I had to take a guess, it probably motivated, this book that I know you're working on and that you've shared. It's an excerpt with me about it. So I'd love to start there. Like, you're writing a book. What's it about? How'd you decide to write it?
Yes, so as a result, I've always kind of researched and written around what I do. I'm very much a kind of constructive in terms of how I approach work and life. So there was so much information around AI, and I was beginning to think, well, how do I communicate this with students? And the first few sessions that I spoke to students about AI, they were like rabbits in headlights. You could see the shock factor. And then I felt like that as well because I was thinking, wow, I didn't know how to negotiate this. Very honest with them, saying, this is all new. We're learning. We're going to go through this together. And from those experiences, and then beginning to communicate with fellow academics around how I was using AI, it was very clear that on lots of social media channels, there's lots of information out there for academics, that there wasn't much out there for students. Not information that was sanctioned by publishers and so on. It was, I mean, you get the odd, well, you get lots of them kind of, you even get influencers now kind of promoting the use of AI tools to write assignments and so on. So I sat down and systematically kind of broke down how would I put all of this together, and it turned into my book, which is essentially it's a study skills book, but looking at how to use generative AI ethically for study at university. Um, I think just to clarify there that you can't use AI for all assessments. Some university courses, for example, I trained as a teacher. If I was on teaching practice being observed, I wouldn't be able to just stop and say, hang on, let me just check with ChatGPT for this answer, sort of thing. So there's a time and a place, and actually subject areas need to decide that. But what I very quickly addressed was actually what does ethical use of AI look like, could look like, and what could unethical use of AI look like? And from that starting point, I began to break down the processes about how to approach different types of assignments with students. So things like idea generation, concept generation, and really literally sitting with students using ChatGPT and asking them, what does that mean for you? Because ChatGPT and these generative AI models are great at content. They're great at knowledge, but they really lack, they fall short of context. So I really put an onus on students to bring the context from their own lived experiences and their own narratives and to really merge the two together for their assignments. So that could have been presentations or essays or portfolios. And quite quickly, I saw students, as long as they had this input, really kind of run with it and actually say, "Oh, David, this is incredible. This is not easy," because it wasn't writing the whole thing for them, but cognitively, you could see there was so much freedom in their minds to actually think about their own experiences as opposed to worrying about finding a reference for a sentence or a statement. And that shift really initially was quite transformative, but I think now I've over the last kind of 6 to 9 months, I've been using this. I'm seeing it as a real enhancement of how we should be teaching or lecturing anyway, and supporting students to address their assessments. So yeah, the book was kind of a collection of that. Hopefully next week it's going to publication, so it should be out hopefully by the end of the year. But the big concern there is things change so fast in AI and AI tools. So I was really aware, and the publishers were aware of this, and we spoke quite a bit around how can I model or write a book that kind of is based more on principles of AI usage and approaches to AI usage, as opposed to just the specific tools that are out there. Um, so even if these tools change, as they will and already have in some aspects, that when the book's finally published, students will be able to literally pick it up and dive into different aspects, and still apply it to their context at the time.
Well, on that note, I would just say definitely best of luck to you in getting it published and looking forward for that to coming out as well. I know that in the some of the excerpt that you shared with me, I would say that resonates. I would say that a lot of these things, if I had to guess, well, given the fact that over the last 15 months, these some of the use cases you provided are still relevant and have continued to be relevant. I think they were relevant 15 months ago. They're relevant now. I think you've at least done some pressure testing over this like very short rapid timeline we've had. But I would say in the book that you or in the excerpt you've provided, my one of the parts that stood out to me, which I really enjoyed, you walk through some examples of different use cases or different ways you can leverage it on different AI exchanges. I don't know if use case is necessarily the right word, but different ways to engage with AI. My favorite one, though, and I realized I gave an example of this earlier, and it was just striking to me as I was hearing you talk about this, and even going back to your chapter that, oh yeah, I really like using AI a lot for this. Is the developing critical thinking with scenarios, right? And using AI for that. Oh, I think it's just so fun too, which is great. I mean, I know that if folks have never done that before, would definitely invite that. I know in your book, you'll obviously talk more about how to do that. But I know here you even provided like a scenario that would be appropriate to use like in teacher PDs, like around safeguarding concerns for like a 7-year-old. Like, how could you do that? And you provided a scenario. I also think there's so many ways you could create scenarios for students, role play based scenarios. And it's fun, right? It feels gamified. It feels like a fun thing. And the nice thing about those scenarios is I think one of the challenges that a lot of teachers are feeling right now is that with their assignments, ChatGPT makes it to where they could just give them all the answers, right? But I've had some prior guests on, and I really appreciate this like calibration. They're saying like, well, in a world with ChatGPT, just like as it was with the calculator and class, just assume it's an open book test, right? And there are ways to make a test or a concept or a problem very difficult, even when a student maybe has all the pieces that they need, and now they have to figure out how to put those together. And scenarios feel like a fantastic way to do that, right? Because they could be maybe subjective. There could be a lot of ways to think about it. There could be a lot of ways to like demonstrate your thinking to navigate whatever that is. So all that to say, I just wanted to highlight that as one part of the chapter you shared that really stood out to me. I really like using scenarios, and I love how easy AI makes it to create a scenario that you get to just experience versus having to think about it yourself and create your own scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I think the possibilities are endless, really, with it. And again, for me, this links back to assessment and having opportunities like negotiated assessment really open up opportunities for students. I've recently I teach quite a few international students, and I think for students who have English as an additional language, who, for example, are postgraduate students, if they arrive in England and they're in lectures within 2 weeks of arriving here, the whole cultural shock, as well as having to kind of get to grips with postgraduate studies in England, which is usually quite different to postgraduate studies in their home country. Actually using AI models to help them with the scenarios, to get them feedback, to get them structure. And I know it's working because we were on a trip recently to Oxford with a range of postgraduate students, not just from the course I taught. And a student came up to thank me for having taught one of her friends how to use ChatGPT to help them with their assignments, because her friend had taught her and now she's using it and she'd found it really useful. And you just think, my work here is done. Brilliant. I just want more people to go out there and kind of see this optimistic can-do approach to using AI in assessments, because I think we will reap the benefits from it. And hopefully, yeah, my book is kind of my first attempt at putting a stamp on it as such.
David, if folks are really interested in connecting you, learning more about your work, being able to see when that book is published in case they're interested in picking that up in a few months here and when that does come out, how would you invite them to connect with you?
Yeah, so they can find me. I'm on LinkedIn or X, are my kind of two main social media channels. I also work for the University of Northampton, so if you search for my name, that will usually be one of the first things that comes up, and I'm easily accessible through emails there. I will, as soon as the book gets into production, I'll be doing some more kind of marketing and publication stuff around that. But yeah, I mean, I'd welcome contacts from anybody, and I just hope that this session and stuff has been of use. And obviously, thank you for your time, Daniel. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well said. David, thanks so much for your time today.